Hello everyone, this is Amanda. I'm a Ditto educator, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make a simple pair of pajama pants. I'm using the Ditto gender neutral pajama pant pattern that is designed for woven fabrics. It has an elastic waistband and side seam pockets. Many of the techniques I'm going to show you will work with several of our other Ditto branded elastic waist pants. This tutorial is beginner friendly. As a bonus, I'll show you how to upgrade your pants to have a drawstring as well. First, we are going to cut out the pant legs. I'm using a quilting cotton. I washed, dried, and ironed my fabric before use. For this pattern, I'm starting with the back legs and I'm cutting on the fold so that I get 2 back leg pieces. As you can see, I used my pattern weights to keep my fabric in place and placed splicing stickers on the 3 red dots that showed up on my fabric. Before moving your pattern piece, take a moment to mark all your notches. I'm using a marker with disappearing ink. Make sure you mark both sides. I also like to make a little mark so I know that this is a back piece. Once you're ready to cut the rest of your pant leg, just press the red arrow on your workspace and send to projector. You can then use the splicing dots to match up your pattern piece and continue cutting. I'm also using my pattern weights to keep my fabric in place as I cut the rest of this pattern piece. Once you have 2 of the back legs cut out, we can move on to the front piece. Use your finger to pull the pattern piece into the workspace and send to projector. Just like the back piece, I'm lining up my fabric on the fold so I can cut out 2 at a time. I'm using my pattern weights to keep my fabric in place and splicing stickers to align my pattern piece as I cut. Always remember to mark all the notches on both sides. Now we can slide our piece over in the workspace and then slide our fabric to match up with our splicing stickers and continue cutting. Next, we need to cut 4 of the pocket bag piece. I'm using some scrap of my fabric to cut, and I have it doubled up so that I get 2 at a time. If you find cutting tight curves like this tricky, you can always trace the pattern onto your fabric and cut with a pair of scissors. Be sure to mark your notches on both pieces of fabric. I tend to mark my notches by lifting my fabric slightly and transferring the mark to the other side of the fabric as well. Another way you could go about it is mirroring your pattern piece and flipping it over and tracing those notch marks. Next, it's suggested to finish all the edges of your pieces. I'm using a serger here, but next I will show you how to use a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. To finish your edge on a sewing machine, set your machine to a zigzag and stitch across the edge of your fabric. This will keep your fabric from fraying when washing and wearing. Now that we have all our pieces cut out and the edges finished, we're going to start putting our pants together. The first step is to put one front and one back together with the right sides together and pin the inseam. When pinning a seam like this, I like to match up the top edges and the bottom hem and then work my way with my pins. If there's any notches, use those as a guide to match up your pieces. Once you pin one pant leg, you can do the same thing on the other, matching up the right sides, one front and one back together. Now we can sew this on our sewing machine. This pattern has a 5/8 seam allowance. Be sure to backstitch at the top and bottom of all your seams. Repeat this step on the other pant leg. Once completed, take your pants to the ironing board and press the seam open. Next, lay one pant leg on top of the other, right sides together, and match up the curve. Pin around the curve using the notches and the seam as a guide. Just like the inseam seam, we're going to sew this curve with a 5/8 seam allowance, back stitching at the top and the bottom. To reinforce the seam, sew 1/4 inch in, using the notches as a start and end point. I'm using the edge of my foot as a guide to mark that 1/4 inch. Now press open where possible on those seams. Next, we're going to attach our side seam pockets. Use the notches marked on the pockets and on the side seam of your pant legs as guides to place your pockets and pin in place. Repeat this on the other side of the front and on the side seams of the back piece. I'm sewing my pockets with a 3/8 seam allowance across the entire edge of that pocket. Repeat on all 4 side seams. Once sewn, press the seam allowance of both the pants and the pocket towards the pocket bag. Repeat this on all 4 pocket pieces. Next, we're going to top stitch onto the pocket bag to keep that seam allowance in place. With my seam allowance pressed towards the pocket, I'm stitching down the pocket on the right side. Now we can line up the side seams and the pockets and pin in place. This is a great time to clip any threads you have from top stitching your pockets. When lining up the pocket bags, make sure that the folded over part of the pocket and the top stitch is lined up. This will ensure that you won't see any of that when you're wearing the pants. Pin the entire length of the side seam on both sides, as well as the pocket bag. Again, be sure that at the bottom of your pocket, all your seams are matching up. Start at the waist and sew with a 5/8 seam allowance. When you get 5/8 of the way into your pocket, stop. I like to backstitch just a few stitches to secure my pocket. Sink your needle into your fabric, lift the foot, and turn your fabric to start sewing around the pocket. Once you get around the curve of the pocket bottom, repeat the same step we did when we started the pocket. Stitch past the pocket seam, backstitch, drop your needle, lift the foot, and pivot your fabric. Continue sewing down the side seam to the hem. Press the seam allowance of the pocket towards the pocket bag, which should be in the front of your pants. As you work your way down the pant leg, you can start pressing that seam allowance open. Repeat on the other side. Now your side seam pocket is complete, and we can move on to the waistband. I'm now going to show you as a little bonus how to add a drawstring to your waistband. This is not in the instructions, but makes a really nice detail on your pajama pants. To start, cut a piece of fusible interfacing 2 inches by 1 inch. I drew a general area where the buttons will go. They're about 1 inch apart. To mark the placement on your pants, measure down 1.5 inches. That's where we're going to fold the pants. Then measure another inch. That's where we're going to sew the pants. Take a moment to mark that area. We can now place our interfacing patch right above that marking. Iron your fusible interfacing in place. Something I like to do to transfer my markings from the wrong side to the right side is place pins at the top of my buttonhole markings. I can then see them on the front of the pant. From there, I can add a little marking and measure properly for my buttons. I'm placing a buttonhole a 1/2 inch away from the seam and 5/8 inch in length. Now I'm going to use my buttonhole attachment on my sewing machine to create buttonholes that are the right size. Check the manual of your machine on how to create a buttonhole. I find that a 5/8 buttonhole is a really great size for this type of waistband. My buttonhole attachment starts my button at the bottom. To match up my two buttonholes, I like to use a pin to see better where I want to place the button foot. Once in place, I can then sew that buttonhole. Next, we're going to open our buttonholes. You have to do this before creating the waistband. I like to place a pin at the top of my buttonhole when using my seam ripper to open the buttonhole. It acts as a stopper and I don't have to worry about going through my buttonhole. Now that the drawstring buttonholes are in place, we can fold over and close off the waistband. If you don't want to add a drawstring, you could skip to this step. I'm using a hem gauge or a ruler to measure 1.5 inches down and fold over what will become my waistband casing. On some patterns, the pocket will sit inside the waistband to hold it in the front of the pant. Be sure to press it nicely inside the waistband before pinning. Work around the entire waistband, folding down 1.5 inches and pinning in place. Next, we're going to sew the casing. I start just past the center back seam, backstitch, and I'm sewing about 1 inch below the fold of my fabric. When you get back to the center back, be sure to stop short of your seam to leave at least 1 inch open to get your elastic inside the casing. I like to give my waistband a nice press before sending the elastic in. As you can see, this little opening is where we're going to set our elastic. For these pants, use 3/4 or 1 inch wide elastic. Then cut the elastic to your waist measurement minus an inch. You can always wrap the elastic around yourself to figure out what amount you would like to use. I use a safety pin on the end of the elastic to thread the elastic through the waistband channel. Once you get the elastic all the way through the casing, adjust the fabric around the elastic to be more even. Leave a few inches of your elastic hanging out to sew together. I overlap the edges of my elastic an inch and pin in place. If some of your elastic has frayed ends, you can cut a little bit off to make it a cleaner finish. Now we can stitch our elastic. To sew our elastic, I like to sew a zigzag pattern with a straight stitch back and forth over that 1 inch overlap. Be sure to backstitch at the beginning and end. Now pull around the waistband of the pants to get the elastic to sit evenly in the waistband channel. Now we can thread our drawstring. I'm using a piece of 5/8 ribbon, but you can also use drawstring cording or make some out of the fabric. Just like the elastic, I'm using a safety pin to thread my ribbon through the channel. Once your drawstring is through, cut the ends to be even. If using ribbon, cut your ribbon on an angle and stop the fraying with either a lighter or fray check. Next, we're going to hem our pants. It's a good idea to try them on and mark the hem before hemming. I'm measuring up my pants 1 inch and pinning in place. Because I folded up my hem 1 inch, I'm sewing about 3/4 of the way up from the fold of my fabric. You could also use a blind hem stitch to do your hem. Once the hem is complete, while you're still at the sewing machine, you can close up your waistband opening that you had left earlier. Backstitch and stitch over. Be sure to not catch the elastic or your drawstring as you sew. If you added a drawstring, it's a good idea to secure the drawstring in the back so that it doesn't come out in the wash or when wearing. I just do a little back stitch on the center back seam to hold my drawstring in place. Set under the machine, sew a few stitches, and back stitch. Then you can cut your threads and your drawstring will be secure. The final step for your pajama pants is to press your hem. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and your new pair of pajama pants. To find more tutorials, find us on YouTube, Facebook, and sign up for our email newsletter.